So let's move on to our next section, where we're going to look at what types of new incentives for innovative antimicrobials. Now, the European Commission had committed in the Pharmaceutical Strategy to consider in the review of the pharmaceutical legislation to introduce measures to restrict and optimize the use of antimicrobial medicines and to explore new types of incentives for innovative antimicrobials. Now, while a legislative proposal for regulation is only expected in Q4 2022, what can member states do to exchange views in the development of incentives for innovative antimicrobials while also promoting their prudent use? And are there lessons to be learned from the best practices already implemented or being piloted? And what would be the ideal incentives framework to prevent the next pandemic from hitting us all as hard as COVID-19? And surely it will come. So let me introduce Dr. Lotte Steuten. Steuten, she is the Vice President and Head of Consulting at the Office of Health Economics. Great to have you with us today.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a very interesting discussion so far. Also, a couple of things that I was planning to sort of say have already been addressed, and I guess that makes for a good opportunity to focus on sort of more complementary bits. So yeah, this slide basically sort of stated the obvious, and we've discussed this, like why is the business model broken and what are the specific challenges. So I'm not going to dwell on it, and being a Dutch person, directly move on to the next slide. So there we go. Thank you. So this basically, this graphic in a way sort of, I guess, summarizes or at least tries to capture much of the discussion we've heard today. There are a couple of challenges and a number of incentives have been thought about. Some of them have been implemented, but some of them are still novel and have to be tested out that collectively tend to address the broken business model. So the push incentives have been discussed before. And also I think most of us would agree that these alone are not sufficient to fix the broken business model. So then what's there in addition is pull incentives. There are a couple of different forms of that. There's not real world experience with which incentive would be the best one, but of course researchers have worked on that. A very important element of a pull incentive is that there is a sufficiently large market entry reward for the manufacturer developing and investing in the development of an antibiotic. And the size of that has been estimated by a number of researchers, and I'm sure Professor Utterson will speak after me, will say more about that. But the value of that has been estimated roughly between 2 to 4 billion US dollars. Another element that has been touched upon just a little bit, I think, by Remco and Leeuwen previously, is health technology assessment. And I think it's important to call this one out as well, because this also in part informs pull incentives and also has an impact on what would be the appropriate value-based price of a new therapeutic. So when we look at this economic problem specifically, we see there's a couple of issues sort of contributing to this. One is that we don't want new antibiotics to be sold in high volumes to prevent their efficacy. So there's low volumes to be sold, but also the prices for new antibiotics are typically linked to those of the existing ones because we usually only have non-inferiority trials, and therefore it's hard to prove the additional value of a new antibiotic. The third bit is that HTA methods tend to have a relatively narrow focus, looking at the impact for the treated individual, but not necessarily include all the broader public health impact and value that is generated by new antibiotics. So if we move to the next slide, so what is the role of HTA in contracting in this space, in addition to everything else that has been discussed? So the OHE has put out a fairly detailed report on that, and I'm necessarily not going to sort of dwell on that. But I think if we start off with value assessment being the first element, then given that value assessments are basically the type of information that health systems use to decide what is the appropriate price to sort of pay for a new antibiotic, then it's important to consider some of the limitations that we see in value assessments. And one that I will talk about today a little bit more in detail is the externalities of basically the benefits of cost to the non-treated individual. And those values are also not typically measured in randomized controlled trials or other studies. And then there's the other bit, which is the contracting. And again, this has been discussed as well. In the normal way of contracting, the manufacturer would get an agreed price per pill. And this, of course, causes us a problem, considering that with antibiotic stewardship, we don't want too many of those products to be sold, actually, which is a very good reason if you want to solve the antimicrobial challenge. And so there's some challenges around that, and that's why also pool incentives as well as HTA should be looked at, I think, should be looked at together to sort of make design schemes that will really sort of solve the problem as good as possible. So on to the next slide, please. So what does actually constitute value for antibiotics? Well, there's a couple of sort of more narrow, is perhaps not the best word, but the more narrow benefits that are typically looked at for any drug that is evaluated, which is the health gains to the individual treated, to the extent that there's an unmet need solved, there's cost offsets of using this new product to the healthcare system, and also there can be productivity benefits to society, which is considered in some countries, for example, the Netherlands, but not, for example, in the UK. Now, there's additional value elements that are relevant not only to antimicrobials, but also, for example, to vaccines to some extent and potentially to other products. And these are not typically considered in health technology assessment. Some of these are very obvious: transmission value and enablement value, but also there's insurance value, diversity value, spectrum value, and there's novel action value. And these are not typically considered. There are some examples of them getting some attention. For example, in France, these are sort of considered on the side, but not really as part of the actual formal value assessment, the more quantitative bits. So these are like, optional considerations that will shape the ultimate decision to some extent, but it's not very transparent or sort of uniform to that extent. In Germany, they have a new law or a very recent law that allows to sort of look at some of these value elements in a more formal way, but that's about it. Now, in the UK, with the start of the new pilot for AMR, they are actually looking at 5 of these novel value elements. At least in theory, that's what they're doing. So that's all of the orange ones except novel action value. That said, in practice, there are already some sort of complications or some practical issues that have to be solved in actually doing this properly. And I will say a little bit about this on the next slide. So in measuring and modeling the antibiotic value, which is not only relevant for HTA, but also to understand what should be a good pool incentive, there have been proposals done by academic groups mostly, and the EPRU report that came out in the UK is one of the sort of, I think, most advanced ones, but ultimately I haven't necessarily read all of these, but this is one that's been referred to a lot. And it does rely on fairly complex modeling exercises that really require some advanced expert capabilities. So in order to do this properly, you would need those expert capacity to do this well, and that is not necessarily available in every member state, for example. And also even within the UK, by the group who's actually doing this analysis, we see that there are some practical issues which also have to do with the time that is needed to do these analysis. There's also scarcity of data, and to that extent, this is, again, it's not specific or unique to antibiotic assessments. It also happens a lot, but for example, with gene therapies, and some solutions to sort of deal with those data scarcity as the best option, given that collecting some of these data would cost a lot of time. There's also like to use expert judgments. Now, mind you, this is not the same as just pulling 10 key opinion leaders and asking them for their opinion, average out, and put that into any model. There's actually quite a lot of statistical sort of work behind doing this properly. But those methods do exist, and they are used for other products as well. So I think, given the scale of the problem, we should not shy away from using those techniques for valuing antibiotics as well. I'm going to sort of now skip on to the last bullet point on the slide. Sorry, that was confusing, I understand. I think we've also seen in the last year, notably, that there's a couple of similarities between antibiotics as well as vaccines. And I think in vaccines, we are already using some more advanced methods to understand, like, how can we estimate the value of new products that contribute to herd immunity, that contribute to lower transmission of infectious diseases. And we can learn from those exercises and apply that to antibiotics as well. On to the next slide, please. So then the innovative payment models. So the contracting of antibiotics usually goes through DRGs, and we are all aware of the disincentives that those create. So there have been some proposals put forward to use de-linked payment models, where we de-link the payment from the volume sold. One of the, I think, very elegant proposals that has been put forward in 2017 already is by Daniel et al. And they proposed what they call a PAVE award, which is Priority Antimicrobial Value Entry. And the beauty of this proposal, in my opinion, is that it combines a market entry award where you would have like an initial preset entry award, but then sort of progressively move towards value-based contracts. And I think the latter, in our opinion at OHC, is really critical because fixed payment ceilings that are not based on value, proper value assessments, are by definition incommensurate with paying for value. So globally, we have seen fairly little action to date in terms of the pool incentives. As one of the speakers said, we do not have experience with that, which is true. We've never sort of evaluated the full impact of those, but there are a couple of examples out there that have been started. Sweden, already a couple of years back, started to pilot a lump sum payment, but that was mostly focused on existing antibiotics and making sure that these would stay in the market. And in the UK this year, they started the AMR pilot by NICE and NHS England, which is a de-linked payment-based system. And that's piloted and will be evaluated over the next year and on to 2022, correct. So on to my second to final slide. And this I'm going to sort of summarize. I think this sort of resonates with much of the previous speakers said. We have to keep advocating to doing things different from what we're doing today. And in our opinion, a combination of push and pull incentives, but also looking at how we determine what is the value of antibiotics is critical. And it has to be like an international effort. Not a single country alone can fix this. And therefore, it is important that countries like the UK share the learnings of their pilots with other countries. And hearing the new scheme that has been brought out today to sort of do further work on this is very, very good news to my ears. Then the next slide basically sort of reiterates that there is ways to sort of think about the value of antibiotics, which can help to inform pull incentives. And again, using expert elicitation, learning from what we're doing in the vaccine space are very good opportunities to move forward. And then, in our opinion, the volume de-linked payment-based systems are, and so far, I think the best longer-term solution. That said, it always has to be combined with appropriate push incentives and potentially other incentives as well. With that, I'm going to sort of give the word back to our moderator. Thank you.
Lotte, thank you so much. That was excellent, to the point, as we expect from the Dutch always. Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Kevin Utterson. He is a professor of law and N. Neil Pike Scholar in Health and Disability Law at Boston University, and also executive director of Carbex. Kevin, great to have you with us today.
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you perfectly, sir. The floor is all yours.
All right, so I have a couple slides in 7 minutes to share. I agree with what was just shared, and I have just a couple of additional data points to hone in on a bit. This first one, we all agree that we need push incentives, but what's happening right now with the current system, we're not getting enough, which is why we're calling for pull incentives as well. And so this is a study that we looked at all 18 antibiotics that have been approved by either Health Canada, European Medicines Agency, Japan, or the FDA since 2010, so the last decade of innovation. And then we plotted them based on the last 12 months of sales and the number of commercial markets that they've been launched in. And you can see that the first thing that's really striking is how little all of them are selling. The market impact is quite limited. The median is 16.2 million per year, which is not really even enough to keep the lights on. The entire class wouldn't be considered, a blockbuster drug, all combined. And these are antibiotics, which are the infrastructure, the safety net for all of medicine. So something is really messed up if this is how the market collectively responds to a decade worth of innovation. And you see in the box on the right, it's not a surprise that the sponsors for 7 out of these 18 have either gone through bankruptcy or what I call an economic wood chipper, something appropriately close. That's not a surprise, and unless we change the economics of after approval, we're going to see more of this and worse. It's impacting access even in high-income countries. The companies are making entirely rational choices that they're not launching in a lot of high-income countries because they don't think even there they can get a return on the additional cost to launch in a country like Germany or Italy, as you see here. These are the same 18 drugs plotted. Look at Canada with only 2. But the most interesting thing for me here is that even in Europe, even after EMA approval, companies are choosing to not launch or to delay launch of their drugs because the additional cost of commercialization, even after community-wide approval, is too high. Okay, so if this is the situation in the G7 plus 7 other high-income countries in Europe, imagine what the access issue looks like globally on these drugs. We have a serious access problem here. All right, so a lot of this has been said. I love push incentives. I lead CARB-X. You know, we've had 92 projects and 10 projects in phase 1, including 9 that were first in human. So continue doing that work, but I'm not talking about CARB-X today. And we definitely need to reform the way we pay for antibiotics, and subscriptions or a delinked model based on subscriptions are a compelling option. And I should note that while this session was going on, the PASTEUR Act was formally reintroduced in the US Congress just 10 minutes ago. So we have activity. Going back to the first slides in which we want action, not just words. So the strategic question I want to answer here is, how much money should this global pull incentive be? And so, you know, Pasteur, you see the data here in the UK, you know, plan, and it's key to note that the UK is up to 130 million per drug over 10 years. We don't know yet exactly how much per drug or whether they will extend it for the full 10. And these are different programs. The UK is based on health technology assessment, and the US based on target product profiles that are set through regulatory provisions. But they both pull in the same direction. And if we got these, we'd have a great foundation for the rest of the G7 or G20 to join in whatever worked for their national systems in order to pull antibiotics across the finish line. Now, this is the study that is in submission. It's not published yet. I am the sole author. I looked at these, every government report. I was co-author actually on 3 out of these 5 on the left here. But they all call for pull incentives in excess of $1 billion, and many of them are in that $2 to $4 billion range that was mentioned just a moment ago. But I want you to look at the 3rd bullet point. There's a lot of issues, methodological issues with these estimates. For example, many of them don't account for post-approval cost. And that is what's dragging some of these companies into bankruptcy, is the cost of post-approval, keeping the lights on, keeping things moving, despite the fact that they're not selling anything, right? And so what I've built is a very transparent model using the net present value approach, which is what the ERG study did for Health and Human Services back in 2014, and what many commercial entities use. And to try to answer this question, what should the global pull incentive be? How large? And all the data will be fully transparent, fully published, you know, nothing hidden behind anything, because I want others to be able to replicate or critique or to improve this work. So I looked at, maybe we just do sales, maybe we just do a market entry reward, or the 3rd option is a subscription. And then I also modeled the impact of something like the AMR Action Fund, which could be an acquirer in phase 2 and phase 3. And not just a single point estimate, but sensitivity tests to try to get the upper and lower bounds as well. And then it comes with a dashboard that allows anyone to try alternative parameters, or to see, to put in the assumptions that you think are best and come out with your own results. All right. So here's the bottom line results. This is my last slide. And the subscription, the global pull incentive, the midpoint estimate is 3.1 billion globally. And the upper and lower bounds, you see 2.2 and 4.8 per drug over a decade. Now, it's important to note that the subscription prices are higher than a market entry reward because you are prepaying for the drug for a decade. And put another way, subscriptions are fully delinked, right? You know, you're paying for the drug. The company doesn't make any other revenue for the subscription period. So of course that number is going to be higher than what a pure market entry reward, because the company would supplement market entry rewards with sales in the market, right? And you should also note that if the companies are receiving major clinical push incentives, things like a BARDA phase 2 or phase 3 grant or something from HERA in the future, then that should probably offset or reduce these amounts because they've already received some help in the clinical phases. My green conclusion here is that Pasteur and the UK together really goes a very long way to solving these commercial issues, especially if other G7 nations follow suit. And then I tested other options within the model. One was, let's assume that you had a super CARB-X that covered 100% of the global preclinical cost. Everything was free. Even with that assumption in the model, you still needed some pull incentives because clinical development is expensive and those post-approval costs are just horrendous compared to the revenues that these companies are getting. And if you just did the UK and no one else followed suit, it actually doesn't make much of a dent for global innovation. The UK is doing its fair share based on its proportion of its economy to the rest of the world, but that alone is insufficient, as you would expect. Near the bottom, push incentives are good value. If you took away all push incentives in the model, it increases the market entry reward of the subscription required by several $billion. I also tested what would the world look like with nonprofit antibacterial development. And by nonprofit, I didn't mean a zero expected internal rate of return, but something like 5%, something closer to what an impact fund would hope for, or a nonprofit hospital in the United States. And even then, the point estimates still begin with a B, $1 billion. So it's difficult to find a way out of the solution based on this model without both continuing what we're doing with push incentives and, most importantly, having a significant pull incentive from major economies around the world that results in revenues that are delinked from volume for these companies. So there's extra slides in CARB-X, but I'm going to stop. And if you are interested in that stuff, you can look for the slides later.
Kevin, thank you so much. Supersizing CARB-X. We'll pay attention to that. Thank you. We have one question here. I stay on time, keep you all where you're supposed to go at 6 o'clock. And the question is from Andrea Chiarello from Pfizer. What are the panel's views on the feasibility and desirability of transferable exclusivity extensions, TEE, as a pull incentive for the EU, considering the EU's legal competence on intellectual property? I'll go to Kevin first with that one.
So I wrote an article in 2007, Lancet Infectious Disease, in which I attacked this idea, and then reconsidered some of my thoughts in 2016 in an article in Health Affairs. My criticism before was that it's effectively a tax on things like heart disease and cancer to pay for antibiotics. And my reconsidered views in 2016 is that without antibiotics, heart disease and cancer would be harder to treat. That it might actually be appropriate for the rest of the system to cover some of these costs. In the US, there's political advantages, structural advantages to such a thing. There's also unique political opposition, from some quarters within the US Congress. I don't know the politics of it within Europe, and leave that to others to describe.
Thank you. Lotte. You're on mute. Can you unmute for me? Thank you.
Sorry, I very much agree with what Kevin said. So at the OHC, we've done some research in the transferable exclusivity incentives as a pull incentive. They do make economic sense. Also, it has to be said that some of the modeling we did suggest that there will be an additional help, but that would be relatively sort of minor to some of the other sort of bigger things. So yes, it's definitely something to consider, to think about. From, like I said, from an economic point of view, it makes sense, but there's also political aspects that have to be balanced with that. So it's a yes, but it's just one piece of the puzzle.